Hi everybody. I've benefited greatly from this book by Abraham Heschel, The Prophets. It was published in 1962. It's available in paperback, sometimes in a 2-volume set, but I'm very blessed to have a hardcover, which comprises both of the volumes. Heschel was maybe the most influential rabbi in America in the 1960s when I was a teenager. And I wasn't aware of it then, but he marched with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. And he also was a very loud opponent of the Vietnam War before that became fashionable. So I didn't know of Heschel's ministry in that sense, and then I certainly didn't know of his reputation until much later when I was in the book business. And then started to bump into his books and realized how much influence he'd had not just on the Jewish world of the 20th century, but upon the world around Judaism in the West. And I suppose one surprise I got, knowing how influential he had been in theological and philosophical circles, was to realize that a lot of Jews, as well as others, viewed him as a radical. Maybe when we read this chapter, I'll sample one of his chapters in this book, The Prophets, give you a sample of why he was regarded as so radical in the turbulent days of the 1960s. This is from a chapter entitled History, which is a little imprecise, but this particular subhead gives you his position, his essential position about the position of the prophets. The subhead is the idolatry of might. Heschel says, why were so few voices raised in the ancient world in protest against the ruthlessness of man? Why are human beings so obsequious, ready to kill and ready to die at the call of kings and chieftains? Perhaps it is because they worship might, venerate those who command might, and are convinced that it is by force that man prevails. The splendor and the pride of kings blind the people. The Mesopotamian, for example, felt convinced that authorities were always right. The command of the palace, like the command of Anu, that was the supreme sky god of the Babylonian pantheon, the command of Anu cannot be altered. The king's word is right. His utterance, like that of a god, cannot be changed. The prophets repudiated the work as well as the power of man as an object of supreme adoration. They denounced arrogant boasting and haughty pride. That's Isaiah 10:12. And the kings who ruled the nations in anger, the oppressors, Isaiah 14. The destroyers of nation who went forth to inflict waste, ruin, and death. The guilty men whose own might is their God. That's the phrase from Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 11. Their course is evil, their might is not right, Jeremiah says in chapter 23, verse 10. The end of public authority is to realize the moral law, a task for which both knowledge and understanding, as well as the possession of power, are indispensable means. Yet inherent in power is the tendency to breed conceit. One of the most striking and one of the most pervasive features of the prophetic polemic, that is argument, is the denunciation and distrust of power in all its forms and guises. Now he's quoting from another Old Testament scholar, James Muhlenberg. Muhlenberg goes on, the hunger of the powerful knows no satiety. The appetite grows on what it feeds. Power exalts itself and is incapable of yielding to any transcendent judgment. It listens to no voice, according to Zephaniah 3, verse 2. That's the end of the quote from Muhlenberg in a book called The Way of Israel. Heschel goes on, it is the bitter irony of history that the common people, who are devoid of power and are the prospective victims of its abuse, are the first to become the ally of him who accumulates power. Power is spectacular, while its end, and the moral law, is inconspicuous. Now he quotes from John Henry Newman, the great Catholic theologian. Material force is the ultima ratio of political society everywhere. Arms alone can keep the peace. End of Newman. This was and still remains the axiom with men everywhere. The sword is not the only source of security. It is also the symbol of honor and glory. It is bliss and song. When the prophets appeared, they proclaimed that might is not supreme, that the sword is an abomination, that violence is obscene. The sword, they said, shall be destroyed. And then he quotes from a very famous passage. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Isaiah 2 verse 4. Heschel goes on, the prophets, questioning man's infatuation with might, insisted not only on the immorality, but also on the futility and absurdity of war. In a later era, Napoleon, we are told, solemnly declared to his Minister of Education, quote, "Do you know, Fontaines, what astonishes me most in this world? The inability of force to create anything. In the long run, the sword is always beaten by the spirit." So said Napoleon. Yet the most astonishing thing in the world is the perennial disregard of the impotence of force. What is the ultimate profit of all the arms, alliances, and victories? Destruction, agony, and death. As Habakkuk puts it, peoples labor only for fire. Nations weary themselves for naught. That's Habakkuk 2 verse 13. Egypt and Mesopotamia were involved recurrently in a struggle for supremacy. At the same time, Mesopotamia was beset by internal conflicts between the rival peoples of Babylonia and Assyria. Those two countries carried on frequent wars against sedentary and migratory peoples in the Near East who were considered threats to the empires, or who were simply tempting prey for the insatiable kings and warlords. They fell upon the quiet people in the villages, according to the words of Ezekiel, all of them dwelling without walls, having no bars or gates, to seize spoil and carry off plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods. That is Ezekiel 38:11-13. As it was in the age of the prophets, so it is in nearly every age. We all go mad, not only individually, but also nationally. We check manslaughter and isolated murders. We wage wars and slaughter whole peoples. Ferocity appears natural, generosity superimposed. Since the natural often seems sacred, we seldom dare suppress or try to remake what has been called all that fine belligerence within us. We measure manhood by the sword and are convinced that history is ultimately determined on the fields of battle. But God says, Isaiah 48 verse 22 and 57 verse 21, "There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked." Now he quotes here from von Moltke, who expresses the sentiment of the great majority of people who make peace with war. Von Moltke says, perpetual peace is a dream, and not even a beautiful dream. And war is an integral part of God's ordering of the universe. In war, man's noblest virtues come into play. Courage and renunciation, fidelity to duty, and a readiness for sacrifice that does not stop short of offering up life itself. Without war, the world would become swamped in materialism. Well, we can see while von Moltke is in the majority, the world will never have peace. But Heschel goes on, David, at one time, assembled at Jerusalem all officials of Israel, the officers, the commanders, the mighty men, all the seasoned warriors. Then he rose to his feet and said, "Hear me, my brethren and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and I made preparations for building. But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a warrior and have shed blood. It is Solomon your son who shall build my house." That from 1 Chronicles 28, 1-3 and verse 6. The chronicler did not regard the wars of David as wrong. Far from it. God was with David wherever he went, and his victories over the enemies assured security to Israel, so that violent men shall waste them no more as formerly, and established his throne forever. David's wars were regarded as a necessary evil, but the fierce doings David was involved in made him unfit to build the house for the Lord. So the chronicler, while accommodating war in the overall plan of God, in the building of the kingdom of Israel as the kingdom of God on earth, and its only exemplar at that point, made his peace with war too. But interestingly, he does not think that that state of being of the human race is going to advance the purpose, the ultimate purpose of God to bring a blessing to all nations. And in the footnote to that comment of the chronicler, that David, at least in the way it's presented in Chronicles, is not excused exactly for his wars, but wars are accommodated in the grand plan of God as a temporary phase in the development of the kingdom of God on earth. He makes the point that elsewhere in the Old Testament, namely in the books of Samuel, there's a different reason given for David not being able to build the temple, having in the book of Samuel, in 1 Kings 5 verse 3, by the way, he's in a letter to Hiram, the king of Tyre, he's presented as being too busy to build the temple, whereas in Chronicles the extra insight that the priestly ministry brings to Israel is that no, it's not for that reason that David did not build it. God had said to him explicitly through Nathan that he had blood on his hands. So we should think deeply about that today, it seems to me, and Heschel does in subsequent pages of this chapter. So next time we're going to discuss how the prophets dealt with the Assyrian terror. And I'll put a link on to a video we did about a year ago, which is Isaiah, 2 Ways to Power.